streets of the streets. Come with us and you will see. This our town of Halloween. This is Halloween, this is Halloween. We'll scream in the dead of night. This is Halloween, everybody make a scene. Trick or treat, till the news gonna talk right. It's our town, everybody scream. It's time. This town we call home, everyone has their pumpkin song. In this town, don't we love it now? Everybody's waiting for the next surprise. Well, that's coming and hiding the slash and something waiting for the monster now. This is Halloween, aren't you scared? Well, that's just fine. Let's see, everyone in the side with the pump in the tail of night. Everybody scream, everybody scream. Your town of Halloween, the tearaway face, here in a flash and gun. I am the who conquers that. I am the wind like you really are here. I am the shadow on the moonlit night. Filling your dreams to the brightest light. This is Halloween, this is Halloween, 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 Halloween. Tender lovelies everywhere. Life's so fun without a scare. That's a joke that we're gonna need in our town of Halloween. In this town, don't be loving now. Everyone's waiting for the next surprise. Skeleton Jack might get you in the night. Straight on the bench, you make you chill back from your shame. This is Halloween, everyone's saying, would you please make way for a very special guy? I hope that chance keep on coming back. Everyone feels to the pumpkin tree. This is Halloween, this is Halloween, Halloween. We call home, everyone hail to the pumpkin song.
Salutations, ghouls and freaks. Welcome to Podcast of the Storm, where insane slashers, undead blood drinkers, and all around crooked beans convene to talk and debate all things pop culture. With me, as always, is my co-host, the Mage of Madness, aka the Authenticator, Dalton L. Mortimer.
Hello and good evening, creatures of the night.
And I am your host / Scarecrow impersonator, the Brainstormer Pop Culture. How is everyone doing tonight?
I am doing well. It feels good that it's almost Halloween again, and that in and of itself is enough to make me happy sometimes.
Yes, so just a quick update. I am still trying to figure out how to use Streamlabs. So hopefully by next week we'll be able to use it. Yeah.
Technical difficulties are still being difficult, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, so we have a relatively fun, ghoulish evening planned. Dalton, if you would kindly start us off with, we had tried, full disclosure, I had tried to find the early Universal Monster movies to watch so we could do a review of them. Unfortunately, I was not able to, but I was able to catch up with various clips recorded on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe Dalton will mostly contribute to this topic. I will put in what I can.
Yeah. Okay, so for those that don't know, long before the MCU was ever a twinkle in the eye of Kevin Feige, the very first shared universe in film history was the Universal Monster franchise. Mainly comprised of five separate franchises. That being, of course, Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, The Mummy, starring Lon Chaney, the Frankenstein movies. I do not know who starred as Frankenstein's monster off my head.
Boris Karloff.
The Creature of the Black Lagoon and The Invisible Man. And they were sort of famous for being the first movies to ever, the first major franchise to ever try to justify crossovers. You had movies like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and that was the one I forgot. And of course, the Wolfman starring Lon Chaney Jr. Yeah, but they were the first crossovers to ever be attempted in modern film history, and therefore will always have a special place in the hearts of many film fans. Most of them, obviously, are based on Gothic and Victorian novels, because for those that whine and complain about modern movies being nothing but adaptations and remakes, film has been doing that literally since it first started, because film has always been an adaptational medium. I'm not sure which one Brainstormer wants to start with, though.
I just kind of assume we would start with the most popular ones and then go into the obscure ones. Relatively, of course.
So,
I kind of figure Frankenstein would be first one. I kind of figure the Frankenstein would be the first one.
Yeah. The thing about the 1930s Frankenstein, though, is unfortunately it probably has the least to do with its actual source material, because for those that don't know, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein had a subtitle when it was originally published: Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And the reason it was called that is because essentially the doctor's goal is to create the ideal human being. Unfortunately for the doctor, because he used mangled bits of corpses to build this being out of, said being was grotesquely horrifying in shape. But otherwise, and this is sort of the irony of Frankenstein, he was successful. The monster had a very noble, very intelligent soul that epitomized everything about sort of humanitarian virtue. But because he was a monster, quote unquote, nobody loved him, and because nobody loved him, he went freaking insane. And given that he was also physically as close to perfect as a human being can get, that was very dangerous, because it meant that he could easily destroy things and people. In the 1930s version, however, as most people know, the monster is nothing in regards to intelligence, and he doesn't even really have much in the way of physical strength beyond being, looming and imposing, at least not as we can see displayed in the movie. I guess the director or whoever felt the Frankenstein novel was a little bit too high concept for the audience in the 1930s, but to that I would say, if the book is popular enough to justify making the movie in the first place, then once again I must have to say, if you're adapting an IP, your first loyalty should be to the IP, because something about the IP worked with people. Otherwise, it wouldn't be popular enough to justify making it into a movie in the first place. But that's me complaining about lessons that we apparently still haven't learned 70 plus years later. But oh well.
Right. Well, my general thoughts is while it's not is not great in terms of adaptation, I do think on its own it's rather fine.
Mhm.
The acting by Boris Karloff, which actually isn't his real name. It was more of a stage name.
Mhm.
I will in time I will look up his actual real name, but there is a lot of there's a lot of emotion under the simplicity of that character of the monster. Because
Well,
he's supposed
in both cases, he was supposed to be sort of like a child. Because essentially the doctor succeeded in creating a life as he wanted,
right.
and therefore
How
he created a child in the body of a extremely powerful human being.
right. However, and there's a review by one of my favorite YouTubers on YouTube called Dr. Wolfiot. He's a horror reviewer and enthusiast. I would highly recommend and suggest checking him out.
Mhm.
He did a review of the movie, and he brought up that it's supposed to be like a prototype of new life that the monster is. That he is not the final product in terms of the movie itself.
Yeah. Which makes it all the more important that when you have a child, especially a child with the body of a human being, a fully grown human being, and then some, you probably shouldn't abuse it because that will create a monster.
Right,
As
and
we know it did.
I think that was mainly because of the assistant, who I forget the name of. I don't think it's Igor. Is it in the movie? It's Igor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Igor.
I thought it was something different, but either way, he he is cruel to the monster and often taunts it and threatens it with fire, while the doctor is very negligent and again treats it like a science experiment, which it is, but obviously to us
also, for all intents and purposes, your child, Doc, and you're being an abusive parent.
Well, a negligent.
If nothing else, this goes to show abusive parenting leads to bad things.
Right, and my point is the performance of the monster. Well, the performances throughout are actually rather good, if not hokey, but I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah, 1930s pulp movie, so yeah, it's going to be a little bit hokey, but
right. I'm not. That's not really anything. I was just pointing that out, but there is a lot to each character in terms of subtleties and things. The thing.
Honestly, in terms of modern horror, I wouldn't even, by modern standards, consider Frankenstein a horror movie. If anything, it's a tragedy because throughout the movie we see people at first treating the monster kindly, and then once they realize who and what he is, completely switching. And
well, I would also chop that up to it's also a period piece as well. Like I believe it's in the. Well,
yeah, it's set in the original time that Mary Shelley would have written it, so
right,
1890s, I believe.
Right, and it's also in like a back country of Europe. So not a back country of Europe. I meant.
Yeah, it's Eastern European, I believe. Most of these sorts of movies, you can get away with just chalking them all up to Transylvania,
Right,
which I think most people have. So,
but obviously my point is that due to the time it's set in and the where it takes place in, it makes sense for people to kind of be afraid of the different or the other. It's just how it was. I'm not saying that it was right because you are right, and I would argue that the story of the monster, or I believe it was Adam that Mary Shelley thought if he had a name, he would have been called Adam because he's the first of his kind.
Yeah, that seems to be the standing fan theory that the monster should by rights be called Adam Frankenstein. And just to preempt all of the snooty literature snobs out there that are about to scream, but Frankenstein was the doctor, not the monster. The doctor created Frankenstein as a child, therefore, it's by all intents and purposes his son. Therefore, he should keep the family name. Therefore, if we're going to call the monster something other than the monster, it is perfectly acceptable to call him Frankenstein.
Right.
Specifically, Adam Frankenstein. If we're going with the fan theory, deal with it.
So, well, like I was
Sorry, that whole argument of Frankenstein was the doctor, not the monster, really pisses me off.
I get it. But again, my point being is the story of Adam Frankenstein is inherently a tragedy through any medium, really.
Yep.
Is that it is a being that is constructed from the flesh and bodies of the dead, those that have passed, and I believe at times murderers as well, were the body parts as well. And therefore, how does one define its own existence if it is various people's existences that bring upon its own existence?
Yeah,
that
and
is
also creating a life from death and subverting the natural order, and also the predestination question of if my body parts are made out of murderers, then doesn't that automatically make me a murderer?
There's a lot of philosophy. There's a lot of philosophy you can go in with various different types of monsters.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think that's one of the reasons why the Universal monsters are so compelling, is because they do, even without necessarily trying to raise the same sorts of questions that the original source material raised. Even though, as I said, in my humble opinion, I think Frankenstein gets done a little dirty.
Right. But Frankenstein, the movie, like the classic movie, is a classic for a reason. That it is very well made. I believe in a way it is well written.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, again, you have sympathy for a thing that is inanely inhuman in a sense.
Yeah.
You see the humanity behind the dull eyes.
Yeah. You see him basically express the innocence of a child.
Right. I will. I know we're jumping around here, but I want to bring up the scene prior to the darkest part of the scene, but the scene where he interacts with the little girl, which is, I think, one of my favorite scenes from that movie. So
yeah, I would have to agree with you. That is probably the scene that sums up most what the story is actually about, I think.
Right. Is that it is a child, and it felt a kinship with a child who honestly didn't even look at it like a monster, which kudos to the kid, because I'm sure most children would.
I think children do have a innocence to the world and an innocence to people that does make them kind of predisposed to giving people the benefit of the doubt, unless they are broken by how they're raised.
Right.
Which, if anything, Frankenstein is about that. It's about, people and children are what you make them, which makes me wonder. In this version of events where the monster has the mind of a child, if Frankenstein had been a more parental figure, he had treated his child like a son instead of a science experiment, would things have gone better, or would it, or would it still have transpired in the way that it ended?
I think they kind of.
Was he doomed from the start, or had things gone better, or would he have gotten a second chance?
I think they kind of address that in Van Helsing, at least at the beginning of that movie.
Yeah.
Where Frankenstein did.
To be fair, that version of the monster is a lot closer to the one from the book, because of how he philosophizes and so forth.
Right. That's actually a pretty underrated movie, but.
Yeah, I like it. It's especially around this time of year. It's a good Halloween popcorn movie if you're wanting to chill and do some Halloween shenanigans.
Right.
It's a good work with that. With them helping.
Okay. What was I? Yeah. Back to the movie of Frankenstein, and with the scene that we were talking about earlier, the flower girl scene. It's both a heartwarming and a heart-wrenching scene all at once, on the fact at the end of that scene, Adam, I'm just going to stick calling him Adam, accidentally kills her by throwing her in the water.
Yeah. And he doesn't realize when he did.
I think he does at the end of the scene. Like
it occurs to him, but what I mean is he wasn't intending to hurt her. It just so happened that he did.
Right.
A little bit like Lenny from Of Mice and Men with the kitten.
Right, and it's what you brought up earlier, is that it's a mind of a child in the body of a brute.
Yeah.
And I think if it would somewhat be a different scene if they had gone the route of it being an intelligent man, like the world's smartest man in the body of a monster. I think he would have found kinship with little girl still. Obviously,
well, that is the thing. They didn't entirely rewrite the story for the movie. The monster is still very much figuring out the world in the way a child figures out the world, but he has the intelligence and the sort of philosophically mindedness.
I think that's explored more in Bride of
Frankenstein. Articulate that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I think that's explored more in Bride of Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
But okay. Overall, again, like the story is tragedy personified. I would say, at least.
Yeah.
Just because it's really a story of someone who's brought into this world is treated like a monster because they look like one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
essentially the same lesson as, and I can't believe I'm making this connection, but Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. The famous line in the Bells of Notre Dame is, of course, "Who is the monster and who is the man?" And in the story of Frankenstein, I think we can definitely say that of the two of them, the doctor is far more the monster than the offspring, because had the doctor realized the importance of what he was doing instead of just the scientific and philosophical thrill of I can steal life from God and give it to a being of my own design. If he had taken a more paternal route with the creature and given it a name, Allah Adam or so forth, and he had actually educated it, that would be a very, very different story.
Yep. All right, so moving on to, I guess, Dracula.
Yeah, Dracula next. This one.
I unfortunately don't know as much as I do with Frankenstein, so I can't, like, in terms of story, like from the actual novel.
Okay, so from the actual novel, the interesting thing about Dracula is it's told not really often by an overarching narrator, but by letters from one character to another character. So we'll see, for example, Jonathan Harker writing to Mina Harker, or Mina writing to Lucy, or so on. Basically, the plot of Dracula goes approximately as such. Dracula wants a foothold in England, so he calls a law firm, and they send one of their junior partners, Jonathan Harker, to essentially help Dracula get his affairs in order so that he can buy property in England. And Dracula also uses him as a means to gain the sort of knowledge of an Englishman. Because the thing with Dracula is, when he drinks blood, he also takes life, which means he can also take skills and knowledge and personality from his victims. And so he drains for Jonathan Harker dry, and then heads to England. And essentially, he's looking for the reincarnation of his dead wife. Why he thinks this is a thing that is likely to happen, no one really knows. But in a later version, in the Bram Stoker version, they tie the character of Dracula closer together with the historical figure that inspired him, which is Vlad Dracula Tepes, who was a king of, or a lord of Romania in, I believe, the 1400s. But in the novel, you're either supposed to be able to put that together yourself, or they just sort of drop hints. Because, see, Bram Stoker wanted to write a vampire story, so he did a bunch of research on vampire lore. Bram Stoker's Dracula is actually one of the first Western English versions of a vampire story we have, because most of the vampire lore that he pulls from, and most of the vampire lore that was available in Europe at the time, was stuff you would find in Eastern Europe, and in particular Romania. But anyway, so back to summarizing the plot of the book. Dracula goes to England. He seduces two young women, one of whom is Jonathan's fiance, Mina, and the other is her close friend and confidant, Lucy. And they now have to deal with the repercussions of vampiric sickness. And of course, because it's a metaphysical ailment, not a physical one, the doctors are flummoxed. And so eventually, a professor by the name of Abraham van Helsing is called in, because he is a professor of
One second, folks. Don't you cut out there for a sec.
Where
Hello.
did I leave off?
You were just getting you were just getting into Van Helsing.
Yes. So yeah, eventually they realized that medicine is not going to help the situation, so they call in essentially what amounts to a professor of metaphysics and folklore, and he sees the telltale signs of Das Vampir, and essentially instructs them in how you go about killing a vampire as per whatever lore Bram Stoker could get from East European sources at the time. Funny thing about Bram Stoker, he was actually a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which is essentially a 19th century occult social club that Aleister Crowley was also a member of at the time. So he was a weird one, is Bram Stoker, but it clearly paid off, because most vampires that are ever mentioned in anything are almost universally based on lore that's adjacent to Bram Stoker's lore. So, hooray for accuracy.
Right. So, the movie?
Yeah. The movie changes things slightly. I believe they update the time period a little bit as well. It's a relatively faithful adaptation of the book, as far as I know. They cut out the focus on the letters. They streamlined the story significantly, and the main draw, I think, of the 1930s one is Bela Lugosi in a classic star-making role as Count Dracula. Funny thing about Count Dracula, in the Romanian culture that Bram Stoker took most of his vampire lore from, Dracula is actually considered kind of a national hero, the historical Dracula. So a lot of people in Eastern Europe, when they see our takes on Dracula, where he's a vampire, they're very often confused, because he's sort of a national hero to them. It'd be like if somebody turned George Washington into a werewolf or something for us, I think. But anyway, as far as the things that people remember most about Bela Lugosi's Dracula, they sort of update his classical sort of aristocratic air, and a lot of his dialogue was actually improvised for moments where he would have a monologue. For example, the famous "The Children of the Night, what beautiful music they make," and so on.
Okay, well, I got on like that to really add to that. So, the Wolfman then, or the Mummy?
Let's Wolfman then. Wolfman next.
Okay. Ironically, I don't think this one really has a novel or. I mean, it's based
No,
on.
it doesn't. It's just based on sort of generic werewolf folklore.
Right. Okay. If I remember correctly, it does take place in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, most of these do.
Right.
Apparently, like the 1930s had a very paranoid approach to Eastern Europe. Granted, I can't say I blame them necessarily, but holy fuck, guys.
Yeah. A man and his fiance are traveling the back. I don't want to say back roads, but the backwoods.
Mm-hmm.
When they come upon gypsies, I believe.
Yeah, a gypsy fortune teller.
Hmm. Don't remember the gypsy fortune teller, but effectively the man.
She's the one that gives the necessary like exposition when Juan Chaney's character is inevitably bit by a werewolf.
Right.
And we get the famous poem. Even the man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf wind blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
Don, I think you might want to be a little closer to your mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I was saying. Yeah. Basically, Juan Chaney's character is bitten by a werewolf, and they go to see the gypsy fortune teller, who provides the necessary exposition and gives the famous poem. Even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf wind blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
So obviously the werewolf, in terms of the story, does represent the darker animalistic nature of man.
Yeah.
And by man, I obviously mean like human in general, not
the werewolf. The werewolf has always kind of been synonymous with the inner animal or the primal instinct, in particular, lust.
right.
Whereas the vampire is very much, or has very much been sort of the natural counterpoint to that, being the more civilized, dignified, and more ethereal monster of the two. Essentially, the werewolf is down to earth, and the vampire always works through manipulation and persuasion. I think that's one of the reasons why we like to see them at odds with each other so much, because you have the bestial, primal, instinctual rage of the werewolf, and then you have the suave, manipulative, ethereal nature of the vampire counteracting it.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I got really nothing to really add to it. I mean, like, by the end, isn't the guy cured? Or wait, no.
They bring him back later in other movies, so technically no, but for the purposes of the plot, I believe so.
Yeah, and known as an occultist, and I assume lore expert in mythology and
as much as I can be.
Yeah, as much as can be. In terms of accuracy to the mythology of the werewolf, how do you think it does?
It suffers from being extremely dumbed down, which again I suppose is understandable because 1930s. In the Middle Ages, werewolfism was essentially considered to be a subcategory of witchcraft. The idea was using magic, you could make a belt, usually out of wolf skin and wolfsbane, with silver clasps, that you could wear under the light of a full moon to transfigure yourself into a wolf. As far as that goes, that is the one major issue I have with the 1930s Wolfman, and it's mostly down to they didn't have the effects budget necessary to do it properly. But a werewolf, in classical lore, is a wolf with the awareness of a human being. That's why it's called a werewolf. The word were literally, or the prefix were literally means conscious. So there shouldn't be this half human, half wolf aspect to the Wolfman. If we were going to be playing it straight, we would literally transform into a wolf and would still have his conscience, which was always was always one of the aspects of werewolfism that made the church paranoid, because the thought was, even if you were transformed into a wolf, you were still in control of your own actions. So anything you did while in wolf form, you were still accountable to, because your mind was still intact. Which is funny, because in later, like, Hollywood movies and stuff, you see the werewolf curse, or what have you, slowly corrupting the reasoning faculties of the werewolf to be. So it's sort of funny to me. The main reason why werewolfism was considered so pernicious was because you would still have control of your actions. You would have the power of a wolf. And then, of course, in modern Hollywood, it turned into you slowly give in to your primal urges and not have your own reasoning faculties, which is an interesting catch-22 of werewolfism, I suppose. I did like, I will admit that I did like the reference to Wolfsbane in the classic form in the Wolfman, because first of all, Wolfsbane was one of the main ingredients of the belt that was supposed to give you the power to transform into one in the Middle Ages. And also, if you want to use this from more of a skeptical point of view, Wolfsbane is actually toxic and hallucinogenic. So it's possible that at least some of the crazy anecdotes of werewolves in werewolf mode, as it were the result of people literally getting so high that they just didn't give any more fucks. Because they were literally exposing themselves to a toxin and then going insane. Which the full moon probably didn't help, because, as most people know now, in the same way that the moon pulls and pushes the tides, so too it can cause increased blood flow to the brain, and therefore can cause things like euphoria and hallucinations in the right circumstances. That's where we get the term lunatic from. The madness of the moon, and so forth.
Okay. So, Mummy, then.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe it was Boris Karloff also played the...
Yeah, Boris Karloff shows up in a bunch of these. He was the go-to horror actor back then, apparently. Or alternatively, maybe he did such a good job with the first horror movie they put him in, they kept calling him back to do more, which it worked, so I can't complain.
Right. But yeah, no, he plays the mummy, and I believe the plot is it's similar to the Brendan Fraser one, on the fact that the mummy is trying to use, which now I think about is actually similar to Dracula.
Yeah.
Is that he's trying to use the love interest of the protagonist, who the love interest of the protagonist to do, what was it? What?
Your light was on, but I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. What I was gonna say was it's similar to Dracula on the fact that the mummy is trying to use the love interest to that he believes is a reincarnation of his long lost love. Correct?
Mm-hmm. I'm curious as to how much of that was original and how much of that was just it worked in Dracula, so let's do it again.
Depends which one came out first.
That I actually don't know off the top of my head. I believe Dracula was first.
Okay. But I believe more than the others, the Mummy was more horror than anything else.
Yeah.
Like every other one was more. I mean, it was kind of genre-like, but
yeah,
the Mummy had more of a horror style to it. Like it had more long, drawn-out scenes that built up tension.
Yeah,
and to make the audience anxious and stuff. So
yeah, it's way more recognizable as a modern type of horror movie, whereas the other horror movies in the Universal Monsters were often more about what the implications of such a thing were, rather than the actual. Like there wasn't a lot of explicit horror in classic horror movies, which almost makes them not horror movies by modern standards, to be honest. But you know, it was a different time, not to use the old cliche, but it was.
Yeah. Also, just the makeup on Boris Karloff as the Mummy was just as amazing as the makeup for Frankenstein. I think it was a little more complex.
Yeah.
For the Mummy, but still very good, nonetheless.
Yeah, it's definitely worth giving the effects team props for all of these, because you know where would effects be without them? To be honest, they look a little hokey by modern standards, but you know this was the first time a lot of this had been done. No one had ever tried stuff like this. They were sort of learning as they went.
More power to them.
Yeah.
I don't think I have anything else to say about the Mummy.
Yeah, no.
So, The Invisible Man?
Yeah.
Which is the last one, correct?
Unless you want to cover Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Right. Sorry, yeah, my mind blanked on that one for some reason. I was thinking more. Yeah. Okay.
It's fine. Creature from the Black Lagoon is probably the least well known of the lot, or at least it was before Guillermo del Toro basically went, "No, the monster's the good guy."
Right.
Which all the more power to you, Guillermo. I love that movie, but just saying.
Right. Okay. So The Invisible Man, which again is very similar to a lot of others.
Mm-hmm. This one is interesting in that it's probably the most science-based one because it's literally based on a science fiction novel by H.G. Wells, and it I think says more about human nature than even something like Frankenstein, because of course, in other cases, there's a supernatural element at play that sort of makes the analogies that we try to draw on them not work. But in the case of the Invisible Man, it's essentially about a story of a man going mad with power, because a scientist named Griffin, I believe, figures out how to turn himself invisible, and he realizes that because he's invisible, nobody can hold him accountable to anything. And therefore, why shouldn't he do whatever he wants, including kill people as and when they piss him off? There's some speculation that maybe the chemicals that turned Griffin invisible might have had an adverse effect on his brain. But I think as much as the intentions of the author actually matter, which in my opinion isn't much, but if we're to take H.G. Wells at kind of his word, I don't think that was quite the implication that he wanted to go with. I think The Invisible Man is essentially a modern day take on a ancient Greek philosophical thought experiment called the Ring of Gyges. The legend of the Ring of Gyges is essentially there was a magic ring that could turn whoever wore it invisible. And then in many philosophical dialogues, in particular, I believe Plato mentions it, you had in conversations about like justice and ethics of what would you do if you had the Ring of Gyges and had no accountability. And H.G. Wells, I think, was attempting kind of a modern take on the Ring of Gyges with sci-fi substituting for the magical Deus Machina of the ring. And in so doing, I think you could make the argument that the Invisible Man is the scariest of them all because there's so little separating a ordinary human from the Invisible Man. It's a question of if you could do anything, are you sure you'd use that power for good, or would you go a little bit mad with power?
I think it really just depends on the person.
Yeah. Unless you go with the chemical warps his brain out of shape.
True.
Thing, which, for the sake of like the context of the story, I don't necessarily know if I like that, but I sort of, from like a meta perspective, I sort of like that. The guy possibly, even if you want to take that into account, he was still stupid enough to experiment on himself. So, and he didn't bother to do any research beforehand. So, even then, whether you want to say that the chemicals of the experiment warped his brain or not, he was already a reckless, stupid, egotistical moron for being willing to experiment on himself to begin with.
Mm-hmm. I think that's further explored in kind of retelling of the story in Paul Verhoeven's Hollow Man with Kevin Bacon.
The recent Invisible Man also sort of touched on it. I forget who that was by, but it was the same guy who did Upgrade. Is it? I can't remember his name right now.
Either way, it's an interesting movie on a philosophical standpoint. I think the story is okay for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing to write home about, but um, okay. So the Creature of the Black Lagoon.
Mhm.
Like Dalton said earlier, it is a relatively obscure. It's the most. It's I would say it's the more obscure one.
Yeah. I mean, it's unobscure enough that we still consider it part of the grouping of Universal monster movies, but it's it's smaller than its impact on things has been a lot less than its impact on things has been a lot less than the others. Like for example, every vampire movie or story since Dracula came out, either the novel or the movie, owes at least a little bit to Dracula. Ditto with the werewolf and the Wolfman. Um, the Mummy you can tie back to the discoveries of archaeologists in ancient Egypt around the time, and how everyone sort of had ancient Egypt mania because it was around the time that King Tut's tomb was first discovered. The Invisible Man, like I said, it ties back to the Ring of Gyges, and of course, it was H.G. Wells' kind of sci-fi attempt to update that cautionary tale or legend. So a lot of these you can still have connections to, but there's not really as much of an angle with the Creature of the Black Lagoon, because I think um, the Creature from the Black Lagoon is a little bit like the less successful version of Godzilla, in the same way that it sort of grew out of nuclear phobia in like in the post World War II era, and also the idea of like subverting nature.
Okay, so yeah, I have no idea what the plot is because I think again, like
Yeah, this one I haven't seen in ages. I think I only watched it once, so I can't. I mean, in broad strokes, it's fairly predictable. It's girl catches the eye of monster. Girl meets monster. Stalwart hero shows up and beats the crap out of monster, and it's sort of tragic because the monster was semi-sympathetic. And then, of course, Guillermo del Toro saw that and went, "Fuck you, the monster's the good guy. Fuck off." Well, Guillermo is a man after my own heart, but yeah, and again, speaking of the Creature from the Black Lagoon kind of being the less successful cousin of other things, it's very much the same in the same vein as King Kong, but without the giant ape. It's King Kong, but with fish person instead of giant ape.
all right. Yeah, I got nothing else to really say, to be honest.
Yeah.
So, shall we move on?
Yep.
All right. So, the next topic is, well, this is mainly a Dalton segment because he's a history buff, and this also ties in with one of our favorite holidays, and also just it's just an interesting thing. So, we will be talking about Dalton mostly, early 1900s in terms of Halloween.
Yeah. Obviously, most of the modern American concept of Halloween comes from Irish and English and Germanic influences. As far as why we still celebrate it, where did trick or treating come from, and all that has to do with the idea of the Irish mischief nights and the American, particularly Midwestern concept of the Devil's Night, which was essentially because of the pre-existing superstitions of, the fear of the crossing of the veil, the Fae folk, etc., people who were rabble rousers would go off and use it as an excuse to be rowdy. And it got so bad that buildings were literally burnt to the ground in places like Detroit. Because essentially Devil's Night was an excuse to blow off steam, and given that this was in the early 1900s and every fucker was repressed to a ludicrous cartoonish degree, when they were given the opportunity to blow off steam, they blew off a little bit too much of it. So the idea of trick-or-treating was sort of resurrected from ancient traditions like like going for soul cake as a preventative measure of the shenanigans that the Devil's Night troopers would get up to. It was essentially, here, we'll bribe you with candy and sweets and stuff. Don't burn down our houses. But, it worked, so the fuck.
Right, yeah. The only way I know Devil's Night is from the Crow movie starring Brandon Lee, which is a great movie, and I honestly do think it is a Halloween movie, so I would suggest checking that one out.
Yeah, they used that for that movie, which was a good poll if nothing else, guys. Good for you for remembering that.
Yeah. So I looked up pictures, and there's a picture on the stream right now of like the costumes from the early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
Holy fuck, they were creepy. Like, nothing made today can look as creepy as these did back then.
Uh-huh.
Like, okay, so since it did start in the 1900s, I'm assuming that most of the costumes were homemade, right?
Yeah.
That would explain why they look so fucking creepy, because they're really bad homemade stuff.
Well, that, but also, again, in an effort to kind of channel the mischievous energies of Devil's Night into something constructive, in the 1950s, 60s, and so forth, a large effort was made to make Halloween more sanitized and kid-friendly and whimsical as opposed to malicious. And so a lot of the early costumes that we still have records of come from the era in between the mischief night era and the everything is sanitized and kid friendly era. And quite frankly, I think this is a case of overcorrecting and going too far to one extreme to compensate for another. In the same way that in the same way that I have an issue with the Comics Code Authority, I think robbing Halloween of its darker roots altogether in the 1950s and so forth probably wasn't a good idea. However, interestingly enough, many of the Devil's Night traditions that were on the way out in the 1950s and 60s ended up being co-opted by the civil rights movement. So that same brutality of the Devil's Night often would be turned against like concepts like police brutality and whatnot. So, if nothing else, you can at least say that Devil's Night did more good than just letting edgy teenage brats blow off steam.
Yeah, it's interesting because I could see the good and the bad with it.
Like I said, I think the problem with either is going too far to one extreme or the other. I think things as they exist now with a far more balanced approach where the darkness and the sort of primal darkness is still there, but a lot of it is also still directed in sort of whimsical childhood positivity sort of ways, which given that was sort of the default for Halloween in ancient times anyway, it's sort of a rediscovery, if anything. In fact, and I'm gonna go on this rant again. A large part of the reason why Devil's Night got so far out of hand was because, being as Halloween and whatnot had very, very pre-Christian roots and was co-opted by the church and turned into All Hallows Eve and so on. Much in the same way as Christmas, believe it or not, was actually outlawed by Oliver Cromwell, who was the one of the governors of England at the time. He outlawed basically all of what we would consider the modern holidays, including Halloween. And part of me wonders if the I need to blow off steam, let's burn down some shit approach to Mischief Night or Devil's Night wasn't a instinctive fuck you to the overly Christianizing impulse of people like Cromwell. So once again, we have people tried to repress something that shouldn't be repressed. The darker aspects of it rose to the surface because of course they would. They were eventually balanced out by someone's attempt to make it more constructive. And then once those training wheels were off, things sort of settled back to their natural equilibrium. So in other words, as per usual, prohibition does not work. You can't just make things go away by outlawing them. All you're going to do is piss people off and possibly cause property damage in this case.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else to really talk about?
Not on this particular segment of the topic, no. I don't think.
All right. Okay, so yeah, our next topic will be one about the. Why is my mind blanking all of a sudden? Right. Yeah. What we are thinking of is. So Dalton and I decided to do a list of top 5 horror writers. He and I both will do, and we're really just going to compare our list and kind of give our reasons why we have those people at that number. So, 5 to 1 or 1 to 5.
Start with 5.
Okay. Do you want to go first, or should I?
No, you can go first.
Okay. Well, this is. He's kind of he's a very famous one. I've tried. I've only read like one thing of his, which is not his horror stuff. But I do think he's kind of an overrated writer in the sense. Stephen King. Like, he's my number 5, just again because I think really his stuff is a little overblown in my opinion. It could just be because it's not really my thing. And most of the time I've seen his adaptations, like the adaptations of his work. But yeah, no, it's just I think he's good at writing. It just maybe it's just my mentality of like everyone, like there's so many fans of his and stuff that it just kind of turns me off to him. It's really just my thing. So that's my number 5, Stephen King.
All right. We may be seeing Stephen King a little later on my list, but that's for later. My number 5, I think I'm going to go with William Blake, which is not one that most people I think would think of, but he was an artist and a poet in the Gothic era in the late 1800s, and so much of his work had to deal with sort of existential dread and chaos and the universe's indifference. So I think it is fair to call him a horror writer, especially given his sort of Gothic and esoteric overtones. Most people are probably going to be familiar with him because he was referenced in the book and movie Red Dragon. He's the guy who painted the painting of the Great Red Dragon, which is actually supposed to be a trail of like a witch's Sabbath. So yeah, William Blake is definitely worth checking out if you haven't. He's not just a horror writer; he kind of is all over the place. But if you're looking for a dark, horrific undertone, you'll definitely find it in William Blake.
Right. So number 4.
Yep.
Okay. This is a weird one. He's essentially a horror writer. R.L. Stine. Because we discussed Goosebumps last year. Check out those videos in our Bootober 2019 list.
I thought we were going with October.
I forgot to change it. I'll probably change it after this.
Okay.
But yeah, so my number 4 is R.L. Stine because, as we had discussed last year with Goosebumps, is that it's like B horror movies that always, it's horror that is written as giving you like the elbow, like nudging you and like an inside joke, like you're in on the joke.
Self-aware and kind of mocking as much as it is sincere.
Yeah. I am fully aware that the books themselves are very kiddish in a sense, but I do think, for the most part, most of them have a lot of are genuine, like the concepts within them and stuff are generally good. And I specifically love his Horrorland series, because that was actually made into like a full series with returning characters retold, like they went to Horrorland and deal with the consequences of going there.
Mhm.
It was very interesting. I never got to finish the series, unfortunately, and I lost the books too.
Mm.
Was the thing, but they were so. It's an interesting universe. Like it's goofy, but also like um, terrifying. It's horror comedy at its best. I would say.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with that. What would you say your favorite Goosebump is of the ones you've been exposed to?
Like books.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good question. I think I've said like my favorite overall is like the ones that are like Attack. It's really tied between two. So it's Attack of the Mutant, with the comic books, and like the supervillain that is from the comic books but is real and stuff,
Mhm.
and a Shock on Shocker Street, which it's about like monster movies and stuff, and so
Mm.
that's kind of my like main two that I really like. I'd say I like Shocker Street more because it's it's fun on the sense that it's set in a horror amusement park based on a horror movie franchise, which is like a horror comedy franchise.
Yep.
It's just so many levels there that I love.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say
Yeah. My favorite, I think, is probably Monster Blood, just because that was the franchise that got me into Goosebumps, and I've read like 3 or 4 of them, and they're still pretty good. Although I will admit that I actually like the version from the TV series a little bit better, because in the books, Monster Blood is sort of a supernatural novelty item, but in the show they changed it so that it is literally the blood of monsters that some witch had bottled. So yeah, obviously I kind of like that version a little better. But yeah, Monster Blood is probably still my favorite of the lot.
okay.
So
Your number
you have
4?
anything else? Or?
No, I'm good. What about you? You're number 4.
Okay. My number 4 is going to be Rod Serling. Because, I mean, he changed the landscape of horror and science fiction and dark fantasy so much with not only Twilight Zone but also Night Gallery that I think to mention great horror writers and not mention Rod Serling would be a disservice to the parameters of the list. So yeah.
True.
Hmm?
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I've completely. So he actually wrote books and stuff.
Hmm?
Rod Serling.
Yeah. What about him? You cut out.
He wrote. I'm assuming he wrote books as well as like episodes for the Twilight Zone.
Uh, Not that I'm aware of. He mostly wrote short stories, which then got turned into episodes of either
Okay. I thought
the Twilight Zones or Night Gallery.
Okay, I assumed our okay, I misinterpreted our
Yeah,
parameters.
I don't actually know if he wrote actual books or not. I will honestly I'll have to look that up, because now that I thought about it, if he did write books, I need to go and read them. Because my God, what am I doing with my life otherwise? But yeah, I felt that whether he's written, full-length books or not, he's contributed so much to how we see supernatural horror and science fiction and just this kind of storytelling in general that to not mention it would be wrong.
True. Okay. I think we discussed this last year, but I feel like it's kind of needed again. What was your favorite episode of the Twilight Zone, like the original one?
Honestly, of the Twilight Zone episodes, I like the ones that are a little bit more optimistic. Which I'm glad that Rod was able to do. That he wasn't just one of those people who just was like, "Ooh, this is supernatural. This is something we don't understand. Therefore, it can only have a negative downside." My favorite, though, is probably still going to be the episode that turned me on to the Twilight Zone, which is the episode "The Mind and the Matter," in which a man he hates people and he wants to be alone, and a friend of his gives him a book about the power of the mind, and he uses it to get rid of all humanity. And then he proceeds to go tiny bit insane because he realized that actually, without people to annoy him, he has nothing better to do.
Okay. I think I mentioned this so many times before, but I want to mention it again. Again, like I'm tied between two episodes, two stories. One is the eye of the one in the beauty is in the eye of the beholder episode, where the woman tries to have facial reconstructive surgery to look like these people that basically look like monsters.
Mm-hmm.
But she can't. She looks, to us, she looks relatively normal. But in a society where the beauty standards are so incredibly different, obviously,
Yeah.
Yeah.
The irony of if she was left to peer pressure, she would have destroyed something we would consider beautiful,
right,
for the sake of fitting in with people we would consider to be ugly.
Yeah, and it's also a good commentary on society as a whole, on the whole beauty standards thing, and the wanting to be in a group.
Yeah,
thing.
And I think there's also an interesting aspect to it where because as we had, not to get too topical or anything, but as we know now, the problem in a lot of the arts today is what I call rampant subjectivity, where any sort of objective standard or an attempt at an objective standard is either considered immoral or outright mocked. And if nothing else, something like The Eye of the Beholder shows us exactly how far wrong that can go, to the point that we'll end up destroying something of value and true beauty for the sake of appeasing whatever arbitrary beauty standard we've come up with recently.
Sorry. And like the second episode is the one, I can't remember what it was called, but it's where this family is waiting for this old rich man to die, and they're all donning masks that represent
Is the episode.
the mask. The mask.
Yeah.
Okay.
The mask.
Okay. Yeah, and long story short, basically they wear these masks that reflect their inner selves, their ugliness, and when they take them off, they rep their who they are on the inside is represented on the outside. And again, and like this is like something you gotta respect with the old school cinema workers. Mm-hmm. The makeup effects for their the prosthetics on the faces were outstanding.
Yeah, and mind you, Twilight Zone was basically made on a shoestring budget, even by like 1950s standards. So the fact that they were able to do all of this basically on the cheap is even more impressive.
Yeah. But I like that one because it's a good way at looking at it's an interesting way to look at humanity. Like we all wear masks kind of deal. And I realize that's a cliche at this point, but
it's also true.
Yeah.
And think what most people would look like if you saw them for what they actually look like on the inside. That in and of itself is sort of horrifying. The idea of what would the world look like if none of us had the luxury of our masks anymore.
I don't know. Maybe I'm optimistic. Maybe I think it'd be better.
Well, I mean, on a practical level, it probably would be better because at least then you could see the truly ugly people for who and what they are.
Yeah.
And honestly, part of me has sympathy for that because imagine believing that you're a good person and it objectively just not being true, and then all of a sudden everyone can see you for exactly who you are.
Well, that's also
imagine not knowing what kind of person you are, and then basically being informed by whatever powers that be that you were a bad person all along. That's kind of horrifying in and of itself.
You can call it naivety, or you just call it hopefulness. I think most people are good, and that when the mask is lifted, they're still the same person that they always are.
It's optimism. I hope you're right. I really do. But
well, I'm not naive enough to, but obviously believe that everyone is inherently good by nature. I'm fully aware that there are people out there that are not.
Yeah.
But I'd like to think that there are more good than bad.
Yeah. Honestly, if anything, I wish somebody could make a bunch of those masks and we could make everyone wear them for a little bit because I think the world would be better if maybe we didn't have the masks up or we didn't have the option of the mask.
Yeah.
And honestly, like I said, it would make making friends a hell of a lot easier. You could literally look at someone's face and see the flaws of their character just on their face. Then again, God only knows what I would look like without my masks metaphor.
Don't sell yourself short, man.
I appreciate it. Anyway, we've gotten off topic. Who's your next?
Right. My third one. Well, this was mainly because, unfortunately, I have not really been able to read many horror writers because I've always been more interested in I've read more fantasy than I have read horror, unfortunately. But throughout the years, we did cover a couple of horror writers, namely Edgar Allan Poe, who's my third choice.
Actually, Jinx, because he was my third choice as well.
Right. He's my third because, well, he obviously has a unique style to his writing, and it's very atmospheric in it by reading it, and you feel like you are the narrator in the sense, like you feel these emotions as you read them and the fear and the terror. It's again, like it's just so descriptive in a sense that it's just it feels real, like you're there.
Yeah. The sad fact of Edgar Allan Poe is he was an extremely damaged, broken person, and I think that's one of the reasons why he was so effective at conveying horror, because he lived, at least in his own head, in a world of darkness and terror and paranoia.
Right.
So he was able to convey what the world looks like from the eyes of the person who lives in a world of darkness and terror and paranoia. And much like many other artists, in describing the darkness of his own soul, he created something beautiful. So, oddly enough, the fact that he was broken ended up making a lot of other people feel way more whole.
Yes.
So, if nothing else, then I think we owe Edgar Allan Poe something, just for the sake of, by taking on the darkness of the world, he made the world a little bit brighter.
Yeah. And which is why he's
people, I think we owe respect.
right. Which is why he's very much cemented in history as one of the best Gothic writers in literature. So much so that he's even been parodied in various pop cultures, and just become he's very much become an icon of sorts.
Yeah, and oddly enough, he inspired pretty much every great horror writer after him. Was at least tangentially inspired by Edgar Allan Poe.
Right. So do you want the second, or should I go?
Yeah. Let's move to the second one, since we both had Poe as a third.
Okay. Now that I think about it, I don't think I really thought about too much. I was gonna go with Mary Shelley, but I've only read a little bit of Frankenstein. I mean, I'm fully aware of the story. Obviously, it's just I don't know the writer. I don't have enough knowledge of the writer to really cement her as number 2. I'm sure you and I still have the same number 1.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Right. Come back to me. Come back to me.
Okay. My number 2 was your number 5, Stephen King. Just because he's probably the most successful horror writer of the modern era. And speaking of people that owe Edgar Allan Poe a debt, he is basically the modern Edgar Allan Poe in a lot of ways. And I like that, especially in a lot of his early stories, before he started interconnecting everything, most of his stories have almost a folklore quality to them, in the sense that you could see them as urban legends or folklore. And in a lot of cases, he was literally trying to create a modern day version of something like The Devil and Daniel Webster or something. Like my favorite Stephen King story, for example, is Needful Things, where essentially the devil rolls into town, or a devil rolls into town, and opens up a oddity shop or an antique shop, and essentially bargains with people for their souls in exchange for these items. And one of the truly genius things I think he did in that, for example, was we hear Mr. Gaunt, i.e. the devil, we hear his inner monologue a lot throughout the book. And one of the things he thinks about a lot is other places he's been historically. Like I always laugh because he goes in a long monologue about how successful he was in Salem, and I'm just like, oh, that sort of makes everything makes sense now. And the idea that it's been this single entity just slowly sort of working in the background of history all along adds that extra little touch of plausibility or substance that makes you think something like this could almost happen. In my case, I sort of would rather be that character rather than meet him, but whatever. But yeah, Stephen King is the best modern day horror writer I think we have, and even if he's a little bit past his prime now, he owes another debt to somebody else who's going to be on my list here shortly. And
Right.
I like that he's unafraid to bridge the gap between the sort of Edgar Allan Poe classic Gothic aspect and the as yet to be unnamed aspect of the other person on this list.
Let's see. Okay, so number 2 for me is fuck. I had it. God damn it.
Take your time.
The Grimm brothers. That's who I was going to say. The Brothers Grimm.
I wouldn't have thought of them.
Yeah. Well, mainly because one could argue that they were the originators of Gothic horror in terms of their Grimm in terms of their Grimm fairy tales, like the original ones, which were extremely dark. Well, you cannot deny that.
Yeah.
They were extremely dark.
Most people don't remember that fairy tales were originally kind of horror stories.
Yeah. They were cautionary tales due to the time frame where people were very much afraid of the time between sunset and sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever was in the woods, because they didn't know. They had the fear of the unknown. And the Grimm fairy tales served as cautionary warnings with various themes and messages. Some were blatant, obviously, and they were just extremely dark, and I think they obviously are kind of forgotten stories, unfortunately.
Well, forgotten in the sense that we no longer have their original impact.
Yeah.
Obviously,
I mean, like, they're not.
Everyone knows fairy tales, but most people, when you say fairy tales, they think in terms of the Disneyverse. They don't think in terms of something that is genuinely to be understood or genuinely to be feared. They think
Right.
in terms of it's gotten so bad that fairy tale is synonymous with ludicrous childhood fantasy rather than something to be feared.
Right. And yeah, like I said, one could argue that they were the originators of Gothic horror.
Or at the very least, that they are the ones who cataloged the existing horror.
Yeah.
That was out there.
True. But
in
my
the world
right.
of
Right.
wherever they, when they were alive.
Yeah, but again, my point is that they wrote these stories as ways to kind of they were basically like dark bedtime stories for children at the time, so they'd behave and not do anything stupid. And
Mm-hmm.
I just like how very different they are from the stories we were told as kids. You know, the fairy tales we were told as kids.
And the sad thing is, even the Grimm brothers versions were kind of sanitized in a lot of cases.
Which I did not know, unfortunately.
Even the original Grimm brothers stories were edited down and censored a little bit, which makes you wonder just how dark were the original versions. To which I say, research East European folklore sometimes.
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, like while we're on this tangent, what the fuck Eastern Europe? Seriously, I mean, y'all have the concept of every horror monster in classical horror and the darkest possible versions of fairy tales. Like, not to be rude, all of Eastern Europe or anything, but y'all need optimism or something. Like,
Yeah.
I would say y'all need Jesus, but that would be the most disingenuous thing I'd ever say. So no, not gonna say.
Right. So I guess okay. Like Dawn, I'm pretty sure your number one and my number one are the same person. So do you want to say the same on three?
Yep.
All right. 1, 2, 3. H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft.
Yep. Though I'm curious for our reasons.
Who else could it be? Honestly.
Yeah, I am curious.
The man is. He was a genius, and much like Edgar Allan Poe, he was tortured by his own anxieties and his own his own fears, and he hated the world, and he hated how afraid of everything he was. And once again, much in the same way as Poe, honestly, in kind of a better version of Poe, in trying to capture the fears and the dread and the hatred of existence that he had, he actually brightens the world. So we owe him a debt, at the very least.
Right. What was I? All right. Yeah. Like I'm very curious because I'm thinking our reasoning for having him as number one is very different. So, just so I can gather my thoughts and stuff, could you start first, Dalton?
Okay. I've often thought that Lovecraft fanboys are a little bit short-sighted in that most people think that he gave the world something new when he gave the world his stories. But the thing I've noticed is in the 19th century, a lot of effort was put into sanitizing ancient lore, whether it was fairies, angels, demons, etc. And if you actually look at medieval demonology or medieval angelology and so forth, the supernatural was, as a general rule, intense and multifaceted. So I think in a lot of ways, rather than giving the world something new, whether he intended to or not, I think he gave back something we had lost along the way. He brought back the dark, primal, existential aspect of the supernatural that we spent most of the Victorian era trying to undo and get rid of.
Right.
The sad thing for Lovecraft is most of his horror was inspired by dreams that he had. So it's very possible, however zany it may be, that there is some aspect of truth to the entities in his mythos. That he was unfortunately inspired by something dark in the existential abyss that tortured him, and that he had to put to paper to make himself sane again. Because most people don't know this, but Lovecraft actually comes from a long line of, or came from a long line of people with mental health issues. That's why it makes me laugh whenever Lovecraft snobs tell me that he was a hard materialist and he was an atheist and this, that, and the other. Because in my estimation, it was probably the case that he needed hard atheism and hard materialism to avoid going freaking insane, because he had frequent nightmares and misanthropic paranoia that basically made it almost impossible for him to leave his hometown. If you actually look at Lovecraft writings, he talks almost fetishistically about how beautiful and how ordered and how rational his hometown of Protestant is, Protestant Rhode Island, and how much he hates the rest of the world and how much he finds other human beings horrifying and so forth. So, to those Lovecraft scholars who might say that he was a hard materialist and he didn't believe in any of this, the stuff that he wrote about, I would say I think he needed not to believe in it. I think he used his hard atheism and his hard materialism as a coping mechanism for the fact that he came from a long line of people who were tortured by something, whether it be psychological or whether it be metaphysical, and rather than go insane like his family, he gripped hard to atheism and gripped hard to materialism so that he could cope with the fact that he was still tortured by this stuff and disassociated from it by making stories about it. But, it worked. So again, thank God for the tortured souls that make the rest of our lives less tortured.
I want to say you're welcome, but I'm not that tortured.
No. You are deep, and you have an innate understanding of human emotion and human tragedy, but I wouldn't call you tortured. Granted, if you were on opium like Edgar Allan Poe was often addicted to, or you were on any of the other drugs that Lovecraft was on to help cope with his anxieties, you might have gotten there. So thank God we live in an era where you can't get pure distilled opium anymore.
Right. Okay, so for my reasoning of why I have H.P. Lovecraft as number one, it's more of the writing than the actual author. And no offense, I'm not trying to separate the author.
But his writing is a work of art. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
He had a command of the English language that he probably developed again as a coping mechanism for the fact that nothing in the world made sense to him.
Right. My reasoning is that one man, through just a bunch of different short stories, created a mythos that has proceeded to ingrain itself in pop culture, culture in general, really.
Yep.
And again, this is just one man just sitting down and typing out nightmares he had.
Yep. Or trying to make sense of those nightmares.
Right. And again, my point is that he created H.P. Lovecraft. I'm gonna say his full name. I'm gonna look that up real quick. 1 second.
Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Just 1 sec. Yeah, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Created such an intriguing and just amazing universe of monsters, oddities, and just overwhelming cosmic horror. I would say he is a pioneer. I don't want to say he was the creator of cosmic horror, but he was a pioneer for it.
Yeah.
He was a pioneer of cosmic horror that brought it to a semi-mainstream that grew and developed over time, that inspired dozens, if not thousands of writers to take on these ideas.
He inspired R.L. Stine. He inspired Stephen King. He inspired Guillermo del Toro. He inspired Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, and it's just the fact that his work, I believe it is in public domain.
Yeah.
And the fact that
in Lovecraft's case, actually, that was by design. He chose not to copyright any of the things he wrote, so that people could continue to add to his mythos.
Right, and yeah, through that effort of his, and it has allowed other writers to take and create and just add to this ever expanding mythos that has become so iconic and loved today.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Lovecraft ever thought that would happen, honestly.
No, I would imagine not either. And given what he went through in his life and how tortured he was, I choose to see his success in literature as his payment for that, because he was a broken, tortured person, and again, much like Edgar Allan Poe, because he was broken and tortured, the rest of us don't have to be, and the rest of us exist in a world that is a little bit better because of their suffering. So
right, and again, I like the fact that to draw a comparison to comics and just pop culture in general, is the legacy of like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Stan Lee, and various others that I can't remember the names of or think of them at the moment.
And while we're on the topic, many people forget this, but H.P. Lovecraft didn't really write novels. He wrote pulp magazine stories, which essentially makes him a proto-comic writer. And that might not amount to anything until you consider that many of the greats of comics, Steve Ditko, Gardner Fox, Jack Kirby, were all inspired by Lovecraft. So, if nothing else, without the brilliance that was H.P. Lovecraft, we might not have a Jack Kirby or a Steve Ditko or any of the other greats of comics.
Yeah.
And that's to say nothing of the people that literally were directly inspired by his aesthetic or his mythos, like the people that created characters like Shimmer Gorath, or hell, you could even make the argument that Sandman is sort of Lovecraftian in nature.
Hellboy.
Hellboy is literally the butchered skull of Cthulhu, so whatever.
Yeah. Hellboy.
Yeah.
Well, Mike Mignola takes a lot of inspiration from various different folklores and just overall stories, and I think one of his major influences obviously was Lovecraft.
Yeah.
If you read like the comics and stuff, and just and he's just, well, his life was very sad, tragic, and I believe somewhat short.
I will have to verify that because I don't know if he died young or not.
So he died in 1937.
And he was born in 1890. So he would have been 47.
Okay, well, I honestly would say that is still pretty young, all things considered.
That's. I mean, he made it to middle age, but that's still young.
Yeah. But
Which would explain why you never see pictures of an older H.P. Lovecraft.
yeah, but yeah, no, it's just like he's he is a writer that that his work has outlived him, which is really the goal of any writer.
Or it should be.
It should be. It should be that the work
create something more important and more valuable than you. I think would be the goal of any creative person.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think he really thought much of. I think okay, not that I did think. I don't think he didn't think much of his work. I think more of he didn't really see it becoming what it is now.
Well, much like many creatives, he didn't really get his due until after he died. So
yeah, and again, like it's just like even my I just again his work is just overall the mythos that has come from him is
it speaks to something. It speaks to something necessary in the human condition that was being ignored at the time, whether it's the bringing back of something old, like I suggested, or whether it is, a new psychic disease of the 20th century and well into the 21st, with like the existential dread of like meaninglessness or something.
though I'm sure if I was able to sit down with H.P. Lovecraft, I think he and I would have a very interesting conversation on it.
He would definitely, if I could bring back someone from the dead to have as his dinner guest, he would definitely make my short list.
Yeah.
But it really pisses me off that so many people reduce H.P. Lovecraft to, oh, he was racist, he was this, that, and the other, and it's like,
I would say I don't. I'm sorry, don't. I was.
Yeah. But the thing people need to remember is, number one, according to the science of the time he lived, races, were impugned with a lot more importance than they should have been. And number two, if anything, H.P. Lovecraft was a straight up misanthrope, in that he hated all people and he was terrified of everyone and everything all the time. So, much in the same way as I think he latched on to materialistic atheism in order to anchor himself to reality so he didn't go freaking insane, he probably was quote unquote racist as an effort to not die of fear.
Yeah, I was just gonna I was gonna say what you were gonna say is like I don't think he was necessarily racist. He was just well, I can't really say I understand how he could be if he was, mainly for the fact that it was the time period he was born into.
Yeah. It was a failure of his coping mechanisms. It wasn't a moral failure. that's the thing. That this idea that it's always and only ever a moral failing if somebody has opinions about race. It's bullshit. There are many reasons why someone might become racist that have nothing to do with judging other people, but everything to do with just dealing with your own personal failings.
Right.
And given that he was a hypochondriac agoraphobe who, broadly speaking, hated and mistrusted humanity and was afraid of everything, I think it's reasonable to let him have that entirely time period appropriate stupid thing he believed in order to make his life just that tiny bit less horrifying. Because if not, then we're literally blaming a mentally ill person for being mentally ill. And are we seriously going to look at the person, in his house in a fetal position, afraid to leave his hometown, and say you're a bad person because of how you choose to deal with this fear? Especially given the science that he had available to him at the time, and the fact that he was sheltered and raised in a bubble by an overbearing mother, and the only thing that made sense to him in the world was his library in his hometown. So, yeah, are we really going to morally prostrate over that, or are we going to see the man for what he is and see him as a very, very brilliant but very, very broken person who struggled just to remain alive?
Yeah.
And remain sane.
I mean, Dalton and I can attest to this, that, I mean, in some way we have been misanthropic in the past.
Yeah.
Still kind of are, I think.
Yeah.
It's not like an overwhelming thing, if any, like.
No, but to look at other people and say, you're a bad person, well, it's a lot harder to grandstand over other people when you can actually see where they're coming from, at least a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I got nothing really to say. I think we covered pretty much everything about H.P. Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Should we just wait to do the video until next week? Because I gotta admit, I'm kind of.
I mean, we can if you want to. It's like.
Yeah, I know it's like still early. It's just like I'm like, I feel tired for some reason.
It's all right. Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, our ghoulish legion of monstrosities, I must bid you farewell until next week. So, I forgot to write down the outro. Yeah. But either way, goodbye, adios, aloha, avideze, sayonara, peace, cheers, and
goodbye and call.